My name is Elena Brooks. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my life, I've been the kind of woman people describe as easy to miss. I'm a daughter, a sister, a professional who shows up on time, does what needs to be done, and doesn't demand much space while doing it. If you asked my family who I was a few years ago, they would probably say I was fine, independent, or quietly doing her own thing. None of those descriptions is wrong. They're just incomplete. People often mistake calm for compliance. They assume that if you don't protest, you don't notice. If you don't argue, you don't remember. I've been underestimated in that way for as long as I can remember. Not because I lacked ability or awareness, but because I didn't perform my pain loudly enough to make others uncomfortable. I learned early how to be the one who adapts, who smooths things over, who doesn't complicate the room with her needs. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing anyone or dramatizing family conflict for the sake of it. It's about what happens when absence doesn't erase history, and when long periods of being overlooked quietly shape the choices you make later. For years, my family barely noticed my life. My struggles were private, my progress invisible. And then suddenly, when I started doing well, visibly well, they showed up. Not with curiosity, but with familiarity they hadn't earned. What you're about to hear is a slow story. There are no explosive confrontations, no villains twirling moustaches, no sudden miracles that fix everything overnight. Instead, there are small moments, missed calls, unasked questions, assumptions made and left uncorrected. There's the gradual realization that being reliable and silent can become a role others depend on you to play, even when it costs you something. I want to be clear about one thing from the beginning. I'm telling this with honesty, not bitterness. There are things I understand now that I didn't then, about family dynamics, about emotional convenience, about how success can rewrite people's memories of how they treated you before it arrived. This is not a story about cutting people down. It's a story about stepping out of a shape that no longer fits. If you've ever felt invisible until you became useful, celebrated, or impressive, if you've ever noticed how attention arrives late and asks you to pretend it was always there, you might recognize yourself in parts of this. I'm sharing it not to assign blame, but to name a pattern that many of us live inside without language for it. So before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever wondered who would still be present in your life if your achievements disappeared tomorrow? To my family, I was never a problem, and I was never a priority either. I occupied a strange middle space that didn't require attention. I was the daughter who didn't ask for money, the sister who didn't call crying, the one whose life updates could be summarized in a sentence if someone bothered to ask. I learned early that being low maintenance made things easier for everyone else, so I became very good at it. At family gatherings, I was present but peripheral. I showed up on time, brought something useful, food, logistics, solutions, and slipped naturally into the background. Conversations moved around me, not toward me. If I spoke, it was usually to respond, not to introduce something of my own. No one interrupted me intentionally. They just didn't pause long enough to notice when I had something to say. I don't remember a single dramatic moment where I was clearly rejected. That's the thing people misunderstand about invisibility. It rarely arrives as cruelty. It arrives as an omission, as assumptions. As the silence stretches so long, it starts to feel normal. My siblings had labels. One was the smart one, another was the sensitive one, another was the wild card. I was just Elena, the dependable one, the one who would be fine. That word followed me everywhere. How's Elena? Oh, she's fine. Fine meant no follow-up questions. When I changed jobs in my 20s, no one asked why. When I worked late nights for years, no one asked how I was holding up. When I moved apartments twice in 3 years, my address updates were noted, but not visited. There was no malice in it, but there was no curiosity either. I told myself stories to make it make sense. They're busy. They trust me to handle myself. This is what independence looks like. And maybe part of that was true. I was capable. I did handle myself. But capability can quietly turn into emotional invisibility when people assume you don't need witnessing. The truth is, I learned how to minimize my own needs because it kept the peace. It made it easier for me to place. I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want to compete for attention. Somewhere along the way, I internalized the idea that being seen required disruption, and I didn't want to disrupt anyone's version of the family narrative. So I became useful instead. I remembered birthdays. I organized shared documents. I mediated small conflicts without taking sides. I showed up when someone needed help moving, proofreading, or problem solving. I was trusted with responsibility, but not with vulnerability. People relied on me, but they didn't check in on me. And I accepted that role quietly. What I didn't realize at the time was that roles, once assigned, become expectations. When you consistently perform a version of yourself that doesn't require emotional investment from others, they start to believe that version is the whole truth. I don't think my family saw me as insignificant. I think they saw me as stable. And stability, to many people, doesn't feel like something you need to tend to. It feels permanent, guaranteed. I remember one moment clearly, not because anything happened, but because nothing did. I had just finished a particularly brutal year at work. Long hours, missed weekends, a lot of pressure I carried alone. At a family dinner, someone asked how work was going. I answered honestly, "It's been hard this year." There was a pause. Then someone changed the subject. No one was rude, no one dismissed me outright. But the space where concern could have lived stayed empty, and I remember thinking, oh, this is who I am here. I didn't feel angry, I felt clarified. That was who I was to them. The one whose struggles didn't require acknowledgement, whose successes didn't need tracking, whose presence was steady enough to fade into the background. I was not ignored in a dramatic way. I was simply not centered in anyone's attention long enough to be known deeply. At the time, I thought that was maturity, strength, something to be proud of. I didn't yet understand the cost of being unseen for so long, or what would happen later, when that invisibility suddenly disappeared. The first time it happened, I almost didn't register it as anything important. That's what makes small cuts so effective. They don't announce themselves. They don't bleed enough to demand attention. They just leave a thin line that stings a little, then disappears under your clothes and your explanations. For me, it happened during a family conversation that should have been ordinary. I had been working toward a promotion for months. Not quietly ambitious in a dreamy way, but in a disciplined, measured way. I'd taken on extra responsibility, learned skills outside my role, and stayed late without being asked. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered to me. When the promotion finally came through, it felt like proof that my effort existed, that someone had noticed. At a family gathering not long after, the topic of work came up. Someone else was talking about a project they were excited about, and when there was a natural opening, I mentioned my promotion. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't frame it as a big win. I said it the way I say most things, clearly, briefly, without asking for applause. "Oh," someone said, "that's nice." And then the conversation moved on. No questions, no curiosity about what it meant or how long I'd been working toward it. No recognition of the years that led up to that moment. Just a polite acknowledgement, like you give when someone mentions a new coffee shop you might try someday. I remember smiling and nodding, because that's what I always did. But inside, something paused. It wasn't jealousy of anyone else's attention. It wasn't a need to be praised. It was the realization that even when I offered a piece of my life, it didn't quite land. Like setting something fragile on a surface that didn't bother to notice its weight. What made it a cut wasn't the moment itself, it was what followed. Later that evening, someone brought up the same promotion again, but incorrectly. They attributed it to luck, timing, being in the right place when someone else leaves, and the room accepted that version without hesitation. I could have corrected it. I almost did. The words formed easily in my head. Actually, I'd been preparing for this for over a year. Actually, it wasn't random. Actually, it mattered to me. But I didn't say any of that. I let the story stand, because correcting it felt awkward. Too assertive, like demanding space I wasn't used to taking. And I told myself it didn't matter what they thought, as long as I knew the truth. That's the lie many of us learn to live with. That internal validation can fully replace external recognition. It can't, not entirely. That night, I replayed the conversation more than I wanted to admit. Not obsessively, just enough to notice the pattern forming. My achievements were easy to dismiss because no one had been tracking my effort in the first place. Without context, everything looks accidental. The next small cut came a few months later. A decision was being discussed, something that directly affected me. Plans were made, Assumptions were voiced, and timelines set. I was in the room the entire time. No one asked what I thought. When I finally spoke up and shared a concern, the response was immediate but shallow. "Oh, you'll figure it out," someone said. "You always do." It was meant as a compliment, and maybe that's what hurt most. Because embedded in that sentence was an expectation that I would absorb the inconvenience quietly, adjust myself accordingly, and require no accommodation. My adaptability had become a permission slip for others to overlook my input. Again, I stayed calm. Again, I stayed quiet afterward. Again, I explained it away. They didn't mean anything by it. They trust me. This isn't worth making a thing out of. But something in me began keeping track, even if I wasn't consciously doing it yet, not in a resentful way, in a factual way, like data points being logged without commentary. The first small cuts didn't change how I acted. They changed how I noticed. I started to see how easily my experiences were rewritten when I wasn't actively defending them. How my silence made room for assumptions. How being agreeable smoothed things over for everyone except me. I didn't feel wronged. I felt slightly displaced. Like I was present in the room, but my version of events existed on a quieter frequency that no one else was tuned into. At the time, I still believed that patience would eventually be rewarded. That consistency would lead to understanding. That if I kept showing up as myself, someone would eventually lean in and see me clearly. I didn't yet understand that for some people, comfort depends on not looking too closely at the ones who make life easier for them. And that realization, still faint, still forming, was the beginning of something I wouldn't fully name until much later. What begins as an exception becomes a pattern the moment you stop questioning it. I didn't wake up one day and realize I was being dismissed. I adjusted to it gradually, the way you adjust to background noise you can't turn off. At first you notice it, then you stop reacting. Eventually, you forget it's there at all, until the silence feels strange without it. The small cuts continued, spaced far enough apart that each one felt manageable on its own. A comment here, an assumption there, a decision made without me, followed by a casual expectation that I'd adapt. None of it is dramatic. None of it is worth confronting, I told myself. I had work to focus on, a life to manage, bigger problems than family miscommunications. So I normalized it. When my opinions weren't asked for, I told myself it was because others had stronger personalities. When my updates were glossed over, I assumed it was because they'd heard similar things before. When someone forgot something important to me, I framed it as forgetfulness, not indifference. Normalization is a powerful thing. It protects you from constant disappointment by lowering the bar quietly. You stop expecting presence. You stop offering depth where it isn't received. You learn how to compress yourself into the version of you that fits the space available. I became efficient with my words. I shared outcomes, not processes, facts, not feelings. If someone asked how I was, I gave answers that closed the conversation politely instead of opening it. Busy, but good. All good. Same as usual. And because I wasn't visibly struggling, no one looked closer. There was a particular rhythm to it. I would show up. I would listen. I would contribute when needed. And when something mattered to me, I would mention it once, lightly, without emphasis. If it didn't land, I let it go. That way I could tell myself I'd tried, without risking the discomfort of insisting on being heard. Over time, that restraint hardened into a habit. I remember realizing, almost casually, that no one in my family could describe my daily life with any accuracy. They knew where I lived, what I did in a general sense, and that I was doing fine. They didn't know what my weeks looked like. They didn't know what decisions weighed on me. They didn't know what I was building quietly, piece by piece. And somehow that felt normal. What I didn't see then was how my silence was being interpreted. Not as patience, but as permission. Not as humility, but as confirmation that I didn't require the same consideration as others. There's a subtle shift that happens when people get used to you absorbing things without complaint. They stop checking where the boundary is. They assume there isn't one. I became the person around whom plans could be rearranged, the one whose time was flexible by default, the one who would understand if something fell through, the one who didn't take things personally because I'd trained everyone to believe I didn't. And to be fair, I helped build that image. I told myself I was choosing peace, that I was mature enough not to need validation, that I didn't want to be high maintenance or emotionally demanding. I compared myself favorably to others who, in my mind, made everything about themselves. But that comparison was flawed. Wanting to be acknowledged isn't selfish. Wanting your effort to be seen isn't drama. I just didn't have the language for that yet. There was one moment, quiet and forgettable on the surface, that captured the whole pattern. A family member made a joke at my expense. Not cruel, just dismissive. It landed. People laughed lightly. I smiled with them, because it was easier than interrupting the flow. Later, alone, I replayed it and realized something. If I had made the same joke about anyone else in the room, it would have been met with discomfort. Someone would have said, "Hey," or changed the subject. But with me, it was safe. I wouldn't object. I wouldn't escalate. I wouldn't make anyone feel awkward. That's when it clicked. Not painfully, but clearly. My role was to be the emotional buffer, the one whose dignity was flexible. Still, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't pull away. I didn't announce a change. I just continued on, telling myself that families are imperfect, that this was minor, that I was overthinking. But normalization has consequences. Every time you accept being overlooked, you teach others how to treat you. And every time you rationalize it, you teach yourself to doubt your own expectations. By the time I noticed how deeply ingrained the pattern had become, it no longer felt like something that was happening to me. It felt like something I was participating in. And that realization was uncomfortable in a different way, because it meant that if things were ever going to change, it wouldn't start with confrontation. It would start with me, seeing the pattern for what it was, and deciding whether I was willing to keep living inside it. Once you see the role, you can't unsee it. It didn't arrive as a revelation, more like a quiet alignment of facts. Moments from years apart suddenly made sense when placed side by side. The assumptions, the omissions, the way my presence was useful, but my perspective was optional. I had been assigned a role long ago, and I had been playing it flawlessly. In my family's unspoken structure, I was the reliable one, the functional one, the person you could count on to show up, handle logistics, absorb inconvenience, and not complicate things with emotional demands. I wasn't the one people worried about, and I wasn't the one they celebrated either. I existed in the middle, steady, capable, unthreatening. Roles like that are comforting to other people. They reduce uncertainty. If Elena is involved, things will be handled. If Elena is affected, she'll adapt. If Elena is quiet, that's just who she is. What I hadn't realized was that once a role becomes familiar, people defend it, even unconsciously. Any deviation feels disruptive, unnecessary, out of character. I saw this clearly the first time I expressed a firm preference about something that mattered to me. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't raise my voice, I simply said no to a plan that assumed my flexibility without asking. The reaction was subtle but immediate. Surprise, slight discomfort, a quick attempt to negotiate around my boundary rather than accept it. "Are you sure? It's really not a big deal. You're usually okay with this." That last sentence stayed with me. I wasn't being evaluated on the request itself. I was being measured against the version of me they were used to. The agreeable one, the adaptable one, the one who didn't insist. I realized then that my role wasn't neutral. It benefited everyone else by keeping things smooth. And like any system that benefits from someone's quiet labor, it resisted change. I thought back to how often I'd been described using words like low drama, easy, and strong. On the surface, they sounded flattering, but underneath them was an expectation that I would continue to make things easier for others, even if it cost me something. The role came with praise, but also with limits. I wasn't expected to need support. I wasn't expected to have complicated emotions. I wasn't expected to change. And because of that, I wasn't really seen as someone whose inner life needed tending to. What struck me most was that no one had assigned this role maliciously. It had formed naturally, shaped by my behavior and reinforced by their comfort. I had taught them what to expect from me by consistently delivering it. And yet, understanding that didn't make it feel any less constricting. I noticed how conversations subtly redirected when I began to speak about something personal. How advice was offered quickly, as if to move past the topic rather than stay with it. How my achievements were acknowledged but not explored, like items on a checklist rather than chapters in a story. I was trusted with responsibility, but not with depth. Once I named the role internally, I began to see how it influenced my own choices, How often I preemptively adjusted myself to avoid friction. How I edited my reactions to remain on brand. How I measured my words not by truth, but by how comfortably they would land. The most uncomfortable realization was this: stepping out of the role would disappoint people. Not because they wanted me to suffer, but because they had come to rely on my consistency. I had become part of the emotional infrastructure, invisible when functioning well, noticeable only if I failed. That's a hard place to leave, because leaving it means accepting that you will be misunderstood at first, that people may interpret your boundaries as selfishness, your silence as withdrawal, your growth as distance. At the time, I wasn't ready to change anything externally. I didn't confront anyone or announce a shift. I simply stopped pretending I didn't see the role anymore. And that awareness changed how I listened, how I spoke, how I evaluated moments that once slid past unnoticed. I began to understand that being reliable and invisible wasn't a virtue, it was a position, one that served the system as it was. And systems rarely change unless something inside them does. I didn't know yet what that change would look like. I only knew that continuing to play the role without question would mean consenting to it indefinitely. That knowledge sat quietly with me, waiting. The shift didn't happen during an argument or a dramatic moment. There was no raised voice, no ultimatum, no line drawn in the sand. If you had been watching from the outside, you wouldn't have noticed anything at all. But internally, something rearranged itself. It was an ordinary day, by every external measure. I was alone in my apartment on a quiet Sunday afternoon, sorting through paperwork I'd been postponing for months. Old documents, bank statements, contracts, and notes I'd taken over the years and never thrown away. The kind of administrative task that requires focus but not emotion. As I worked, I came across my leather-bound notebook, the one I'd carried with me through multiple jobs, moves, and phases of my life. I hadn't opened it in a long time. Inside were lists, reflections, and observations I'd written during moments when I needed clarity, but didn't have anyone to talk to. I started reading. At first, it felt distant, like reading someone else's handwriting. Notes about long work weeks, frustrations phrased carefully, almost apologetically, small victories recorded without celebration. And then patterns began to emerge. There it was in ink. Years of me noticing things and choosing not to act on them. Moments where I felt overlooked, minimized, or assumed to be fine. And the rationalizations I gave myself afterward. Page after page of emotional restraint. What struck me wasn't anger, it was consistency. I had been aware all along. I just hadn't allowed that awareness to lead anywhere. As I turned the pages, I realized something that changed the temperature of the room for me. My silence hadn't been neutral. It had been active. It had shaped outcomes. It had protected others from discomfort while quietly costing me clarity. I sat there for a long time without moving. No music, no phone, just the weight of that realization settling in. The shift was this. I stopped seeing myself as someone waiting to be understood and started seeing myself as someone responsible for how much access others had to me. That distinction mattered. Up until that point, a part of me had been operating on patience. If I stay steady long enough, things will balance out. If I don't push, people will eventually lean in. If I keep being myself, I'll be seen. That afternoon, I understood that being seen is not something you earn by endurance. It's something you allow, or don't, through boundaries. And boundaries aren't declarations, they're decisions. I didn't suddenly feel empowered or confident. I didn't feel righteous. I felt calm, clear in a way I hadn't before. Like I'd been standing in fog and it had thinned just enough to see where I was. I thought about my family, not with resentment, but with honesty. They hadn't adjusted their behavior because nothing had required them to. The system worked. I made it work. Why would they assume it needed changing? That didn't make them villains, but it did make me accountable for my next move. I remember closing the notebook and placing it carefully on the table instead of putting it back on the shelf. That felt symbolic in a way I didn't fully articulate at the time. I wasn't putting the observations away anymore. I was keeping them within reach. That day, I made no announcements. I didn't send messages. I didn't rehearse conversations. Outwardly, nothing shifted. But internally, my orientation changed. I stopped automatically explaining myself. I stopped volunteering for flexibility before it was requested. I stopped filling the silence just to keep things comfortable. I began to treat my attention as something finite, not endlessly available. The shift wasn't about withdrawing affection or becoming cold, it was about choice. Conscious, deliberate choice. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider this question seriously. What if I didn't adjust? What if I let others experience the natural consequences of not considering me? That question didn't feel aggressive, it felt balanced. And that balance brought a quiet sense of resolve. Nothing dramatic happened that day, but from that point forward, my silence would no longer be automatic. It would be intentional. Once silence becomes a choice, it changes its meaning. Before, my quiet had been reflexive, a habit shaped by years of smoothing things over and staying agreeable. After that day, silence became something I used deliberately, not to disappear, but to observe. I didn't announce this change to anyone. I doubt it would have made sense if I had. From the outside, my behavior looked largely the same. I was still calm, still present, still polite, but internally, I was no longer filling in the gaps for others. When plans were made without my input, I stopped preemptively adapting. I waited. If someone assumed I'd be available, I asked, neutrally, "When did we discuss that?" Not defensively, just factually. The room would pause, recalibrate. Sometimes the plan changed, sometimes it didn't, but the assumption was interrupted. When conversations skimmed past something important to me, I didn't chase the moment. I let it pass and noted who noticed and who didn't. That information mattered more than the attention itself. People often think silence is weakness because they're used to it meaning surrender. They expect quiet people to absorb things indefinitely. What they don't realize is that silence, when chosen, can be a form of restraint. It gives you time. It reveals patterns. I began to see how often others relied on my responsiveness, how quickly they expected replies, how much emotional labor I had been providing simply by being available, receptive, and accommodating. So I adjusted my timing. I didn't respond immediately to every message. I didn't jump in to resolve tensions that weren't mine to manage. I didn't volunteer explanations for decisions I hadn't been asked about. Nothing about this was punitive. I wasn't withholding to make a point. I was conserving. The reaction was subtle but telling. At first, no one noticed. Then slowly, small signs of discomfort appeared. Follow-up messages, clarifying questions, a slight uncertainty in tone. People were used to me making things easy. When I didn't, they felt the absence of that ease without understanding why. I remember one conversation where someone said half-jokingly, "You've been kind of hard to read lately." I smiled and said, "I've always been this way." And that was true. I just wasn't compensating anymore. The most interesting part wasn't how others reacted. It was how I felt. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't bracing for backlash. I felt steady, grounded, like I was finally acting in alignment with something that had been true for a long time. Silence gave me space to listen more carefully, not just to words, but to behavior. Who checked in when I didn't initiate? Who only reached out when they needed something? Who seemed unsettled by my lack of availability? I took mental notes, not with judgment, but with clarity. This phase required discipline. There were moments when old instincts kicked in, when I felt the urge to smooth things over or explain myself to avoid awkwardness. I had to resist that urge gently, reminding myself that discomfort wasn't danger. Letting others sit with uncertainty wasn't unkind. It was honest. What I realized was that my previous openness had been doing a lot of invisible work. By always being accessible, I had been buffering others from the consequences of their assumptions. Removing that buffer didn't create conflict, it revealed imbalance. And an imbalance, once visible, can't be unseen. People began to mistake my quiet for detachment. Some assumed I was stressed. Others thought I was distracted. A few interpreted it as distance. I didn't correct those interpretations, because for the first time, how I was perceived wasn't my responsibility to manage. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I was learning one myself. That presence doesn't require constant proof. That engagement should be mutual. That silence can be a boundary without being a wall. This wasn't withdrawal. It was recalibration. I still showed up when it mattered. I still cared. But I no longer overextended to maintain an image of reliability that left no room for reciprocity. And in that quieter space, something else began to happen. Something no one else noticed yet. I started preparing. While things looked unchanged on the surface, my attention had shifted inward. Preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like observation, learning, and quiet alignment. And because I wasn't announcing anything, no one thought to look for movement. I had always been a note taker, but now my documentation became more intentional. Not obsessive, not paranoid, just precise. I wrote down timelines, conversations, and decisions that affected me. Not with emotion, but with dates and facts. Clarity has a different texture when it's written calmly. This wasn't about building a case against anyone. It was about understanding the system I was inside. At work, I paid closer attention to how leverage actually functioned, who had it, who assumed they did, and who underestimated their own. I noticed how consistency compounds quietly. Financial literacy isn't about wealth, but about control over options. How patience, when paired with information, creates power that doesn't need to announce itself. I started reading differently. Not motivational content, not stories of sudden transformation, but practical material. Contracts, policies, long-term planning, behavioral patterns. I wanted to understand how outcomes are shaped over time, not how they're framed in hindsight. What surprised me was how much I already knew. Years of being observant, of listening more than speaking, had given me a strong, intuitive sense of people. I could predict reactions before they happened. I knew which conversations would go nowhere and which silences would speak louder than words. I just hadn't been using that awareness deliberately. My finances were the first place I brought everything into alignment. Not because money was the point, but because it's one of the few areas where clarity is measurable. I reviewed everything: accounts, spending patterns, long-term plans. I simplified, I organized, I ensured that my independence wasn't theoretical but concrete. That work was invisible to anyone else. No lifestyle changes, no announcements, just quiet stability being reinforced from the inside. Emotionally, I did something similar. I stopped outsourcing my sense of worth to how present others were. I evaluated relationships based on behavior over time, not intent or history. Who showed curiosity without prompting? Who respected my time once I stopped overextending? Who adjusted when I didn't? Some relationships grew quieter, others remained the same. A few deepened, unexpectedly, when space allowed for mutual effort to emerge. My family noticed none of this. From their perspective, I was still the same. Still calm, still polite, still not making waves. They didn't see the recalibration because it didn't disrupt the roles immediately. The infrastructure still functioned, just with less unpaid labor on my part. There's a strange advantage to being underestimated. People don't monitor your growth. They don't question your trajectory. They assume continuity. That assumption gave me room. I learned to position myself without declaring my intentions, to build optionality, to make decisions that would matter later, even if they seemed irrelevant now. I didn't rush. I didn't make progress. I let it accumulate quietly. What they never noticed was how my attention had shifted from being understood to being prepared. I wasn't rehearsing confrontations. I wasn't planning exits in anger. I was building a life that didn't require constant explanation or permission. I also began to see how my family's dynamic relied on a shared narrative, that nothing had really been wrong, that everyone had done their best, that history was smooth enough not to be examined too closely. I didn't challenge that narrative. I didn't need to. Narratives unravel on their own when reality stops supporting them. I wasn't trying to expose anyone. I was making myself less dependent on their recognition. This stage lasted longer than I expected. Months passed, then more. From the outside, it probably looked like nothing was happening. Inside, everything was aligning. I became more selective with my energy, more intentional with my commitments, less reactive, more grounded. And in that groundedness, something else became clear. There are moments in life when you realize you've outgrown a structure. Not because it harmed you overtly, but because it never adapted as you did. Staying inside it requires shrinking. Leaving it requires courage. I didn't yet know what form leaving would take. I only knew that when the time came, I wanted to move from a position of calm certainty, not emotional urgency. And that certainty was growing, quietly, reliably, out of sight. The reveal wasn't something I shared with anyone. It happened privately, without witnesses, without ceremony. And because of that, it was more powerful than any announcement could have been. It began as a realization, not a discovery. One evening, as I reviewed documents I'd been organizing for months, I saw the full picture clearly for the first time. Not in fragments, not as possibilities, as a structure. I understood exactly where I stood, financially, professionally, emotionally, and how little of that stability was actually tied to my family's approval or involvement. That clarity settled in slowly, like a weight distributing itself evenly. For years, a quiet part of me had believed that family presence was a kind of anchor. Even if it wasn't always supportive, it was there by default. History gave it gravity. Shared pasts made it feel essential. What I saw then was that the anchor had been symbolic more than functional. I didn't rely on my family for decision-making. I didn't seek their advice on things that truly mattered. I didn't depend on them for financial or logistical support. The emotional connection existed, but it was thin, maintained more by habit than by active engagement. That wasn't a condemnation, it was an observation. The private reveal was this: I had already built a life that could stand without their involvement. I just hadn't acknowledged it consciously. There was a strange calm that came with that recognition. Not relief exactly, more like alignment. I wasn't preparing to leave something. I had already left it emotionally without realizing. I reviewed the last few years through that lens and saw how often my family had been absent from pivotal moments. Career decisions, personal milestones, periods of difficulty. I hadn't excluded them, they simply hadn't been present. And yet, when things started to look visibly successful from the outside, when my work stabilized, my life appeared orderly, my trajectory upward, they re-entered with familiarity, as if nothing had been missed. That's when another layer of the reveal emerged. Their attention wasn't malicious, but it was conditional. It responded to outcomes, not processes, to results, not effort, to visibility, not substance. Understanding that shifted something fundamental. I stopped hoping for retroactive care. I stopped imagining conversations where the past would be acknowledged in a way that healed it. I accepted that absence doesn't erase history, but it also doesn't obligate reconciliation on my terms. I didn't feel angry about this. I felt resolved. This clarity didn't make me want to confront anyone. It made me want to protect what I'd built. I realized I had leverage, not over people, but over my own participation. I could choose how much access others had to my life. I could decide what was shared and what remained private. I could let familiarity exist without assuming entitlement. And because this realization stayed private, it stayed clean. There was no performative boundary setting, no defensive explanations, just quiet internal permission to act differently. I think many people imagine leverage as something aggressive or transactional. But real leverage is simply knowing you'll be okay if someone disapproves of your choices. That night, I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel triumphant. I closed my notebook, turned off the light, and went to bed earlier than usual. My body felt lighter, not because anything had changed externally, but because I was no longer negotiating with expectations I hadn't agreed to. The next day, I interacted with my family the same way I always had. Polite, calm, present. But internally, I was no longer hoping they would see me differently. I had already seen myself clearly. That was the private reveal. I wasn't waiting for recognition. I wasn't dependent on validation. I wasn't obligated to perform closeness that hadn't been maintained. I had options. And once you see your options clearly, the next question isn't what will they think? Which path am I willing to commit to, knowing I can't unsee this? That question lingered quietly for a while, until it was time to answer it. Once you see the options clearly, not choosing becomes a choice in itself. After the private reveal, I lived for a while in a kind of suspended clarity. Nothing urgent forced my hand. There was no crisis, no deadline, no confrontation demanding resolution. On the surface, everything functioned. That made the decision harder, not easier. Because when nothing is wrong enough, staying feels reasonable. I mapped the options quietly, honestly. One option was to continue as I had, slightly more guarded, slightly less available, but fundamentally within the same structure. I could maintain cordial closeness with my family, accept their renewed interest now that my life looked stable, and tell myself that this was simply how things evolved. Many people do this. They let the present overwrite the past without discussion. It's comfortable. It preserves appearances. Another option was to confront the history directly, to name the years of absence, the pattern of attention arriving late, the way my role had shaped my silence. I imagined those conversations carefully. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just factually. But every version of that path led to the same place: defensiveness, reinterpretation, minimization. Not because my family was cruel, but because people rarely welcome narratives that complicate their self-image. I wasn't interested in negotiating my memory. The third option was quieter and irreversible. I could change my level of participation without explanation. Not as punishment, not as withdrawal, simply as alignment. I could stop offering emotional access that hadn't been maintained and let the relationship settle where mutual effort naturally placed it. That option scared me the most, because it meant accepting that some connections might thin out, that familiarity might fade, that I would be misunderstood by default, at least for a while. It also meant relinquishing the hope that someone would eventually look back and say, "We should have been there more." Letting go of that hope felt heavier than any confrontation. I sat with that weight for weeks. I paid attention to how my body reacted when my family reached out with sudden warmth, curiosity sparked by visible success. The invitations. The advice was offered now that it was safe to give it. The assumptions of closeness that skipped over years of distance. Nothing about those interactions was hostile, but they carried an unspoken expectation that I would receive this attention gratefully, without context. I realized then that accepting it without adjustment would quietly rewrite history. It would suggest that presence is interchangeable, that it doesn't matter when you show up, only that you do eventually. That didn't sit right with me. Absence doesn't erase history, and acknowledging that didn't require accusation. It required consistency. The irreversible option wasn't about cutting anyone off. It was about letting reality take its natural shape without my constant reinforcement. I decided I would no longer bridge gaps that I hadn't created. I wouldn't perform emotional closeness where there hadn't been sustained engagement. I would respond, not initiate. Participate, not overextend. Share selectively, not automatically. This decision didn't come with relief. It came with a steady resolve. I knew that once I acted on it, I couldn't convincingly return to the old role. The reliable buffer, the invisible stabilizer. Stepping out of that position would change how people experienced me, and how they explained that change to themselves. But I also knew something else. If I didn't choose alignment now, I would be choosing self-erasure later. Slowly, politely, with no one to blame but myself. So I chose the path that honored what I had already built. I didn't announce this decision. I didn't write it down. I didn't rehearse explanations. I simply committed to behaving in ways that matched my clarity. From that point on, my actions would tell the story. And once actions shift, consequences follow, whether anyone understands them or not. When you move in silence, people assume you aren't moving at all. That assumption worked in my favor. After the decision point, I didn't make dramatic changes. I didn't relocate suddenly or cut contact. I simply aligned my behavior with the life I had already built, one that didn't rely on constant explanation or approval. Practically, this meant tightening systems that had once been loose. I formalized boundaries that had previously been implied. I structured my time more intentionally, not leaving large, undefined gaps where others could insert their expectations. At work, this looked like refining my role and responsibilities. I documented processes I had been carrying out informally for years. I clarified what I owned and what I didn't. That shift alone changed how people interacted with me. When your contribution is clearly defined, it's harder for others to assume unlimited access. Financially, I continued simplifying. I ensured that my savings, investments, and long-term plans were robust and independent. Not because I anticipated conflict, but because independence creates calm. It removes urgency from decisions that might otherwise feel emotional. None of this was visible to my family. From their perspective, I was still the same. Still responsive, just not instantly. Still present, just not always available. Still kind, but no longer defaulting to accommodation. I stopped rearranging my schedule to attend every gathering. If an invitation conflicted with something important to me, I declined without apology or elaboration. "I won't be able to make it," became a complete sentence. I noticed how often people ask for reasons, not because they need them, but because they're used to receiving them. When I didn't offer explanations, most people accepted it. A few pressed. I didn't engage. Silence did the work. There were moments when I felt the pull of old habits, when it would have been easier to show up out of obligation rather than choice, but each time I honored the new alignment, the internal friction lessened. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy, it's about consistency. I also became more deliberate about what I shared. I stopped giving real-time updates about my life. Not because I was hiding, but because I was no longer narrating myself for others' comfort. When people asked how things were going, I answered honestly, but generally. Details were offered when there was genuine curiosity, and withheld when there wasn't. This shift had an unintended side effect. People started filling in the blanks themselves. Some assumed I was busy, others thought I was distant. A few speculated that something had changed. They were right. But because nothing had been announced, there was nothing to react to directly. No accusation to defend against. No conflict to resolve. Just a gradual recalibration of access. The most important movement, though, was internal. I stopped scanning interactions for signs of approval. I stopped hoping that someone would notice how well I was doing and acknowledge the years it took to get there. That hope had kept me tethered longer than I realized. Letting it go felt like setting down a weight I'd been carrying without knowing its origin. As weeks turned into months, the consequences of my quiet movement began to surface, not in dramatic ways, but in subtle shifts. Fewer assumptions, more questions, slight uncertainty in interactions that had once been automatic. Still, no one said anything directly. When people are used to you adapting, they often don't recognize change until the absence of your accommodation creates friction in their own lives. That friction takes time to register. I was patient, because moving in silence isn't about speed, it's about direction. And I knew where I was headed, even if no one else did yet. The consequences didn't have an impact. They arrived in confusion. At first, it showed up as small disruptions, things that used to flow smoothly now requiring effort. Plans took longer to coordinate, messages needed clarification, tasks that had once been handled quietly now lingered unresolved. No one connected these changes to me directly. Not yet. When you've been quietly holding things together for a long time, your absence doesn't feel like a loss at first. It feels like an inconvenience. People assume it's temporary, that you'll step back in once things get messy enough. I didn't. One family gathering made this especially clear. I arrived later than usual, stayed for a shorter time, and left without announcing it. Nothing dramatic, no tension, but afterward, I heard about the disorganization, the missed details, the small frustrations that no one could quite explain. Things just felt a little off, someone said later. I listened. I didn't comment. Another time, a decision was made assuming my availability. When I declined, politely, without explanation, the response was immediate surprise. "Oh, okay," they said. "We'll have to figure something else out." That sentence used to be followed by me stepping in anyway. This time, it wasn't. What struck me was how quickly people felt the impact of my absence without recognizing its source. It was as if a familiar support beam had been removed quietly, and the structure was adjusting to the new weight distribution. No one accused me of anything. No one confronted me. Instead, there was a subtle shift in tone, less certainty, more checking. Questions that hadn't been asked before started to appear. Are you free that day? Does this work for you? Can you let us know ahead of time? Those questions weren't signs of consideration alone. They were signs of recalibration. At the same time, something else began to happen. The renewed interest, the calls, the invitations, the casual assumptions of closeness became more frequent. Not because of concern, but because access had become less predictable. Scarcity clarifies value. I noticed how often conversations circled around my schedule now. People asked about my work with more curiosity than before. How my availability was no longer assumed but negotiated. I didn't lean into this shift. I didn't pull away either. I remained consistent. The discomfort grew quietly. Some family members began referencing how close we all are, as if reaffirming it would make it true by repetition. Others reminisced selectively, highlighting moments of togetherness that skipped long stretches of absence. I listened without correcting them, because the most revealing part of this phase wasn't what was said, it was what wasn't. No one asked if I was okay. No one acknowledged the change directly. No one wondered aloud whether something had been missed before. The focus stayed on restoring the old ease, not examining why it had existed. And that told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't being punished. I was being adjusted to. The system was responding to the loss of something it had relied on. But instead of examining its own structure, it was trying to reinsert me into the same role, just with more attention this time. That attention felt different. It wasn't grounded in curiosity about my experience. It was oriented around function, around access, around restoring balance without changing the foundation. I didn't resent this. I understood it. Change is uncomfortable, especially when it challenges unspoken arrangements. People reach for what's familiar first. What mattered was how I responded. I didn't fill the gaps. I didn't reassure anyone that things would go back to normal. I allowed the consequences to unfold at their natural pace. This wasn't cruelty, it was the honesty. By not rushing to stabilize things, I was letting others feel the absence of my accommodation and learn from it if they chose to. Some relationships began to feel strained. Others are simply quieter. A few surprised me by adjusting thoughtfully, meeting me with more mutual effort. Those differences became clear. The consequences were no longer abstract. They lived. And still nothing had been said directly, but something had shifted irreversibly. The ease was gone. When people realize something important has changed, their first instinct is to fix the surface, not the source. That's what happened next. The confusion of the earlier phase gave way to a kind of quiet urgency. Not panic exactly, but a noticeable increase in effort. Messages came more frequently. Invitations were framed with more warmth. Compliments appeared where neutrality had once lived. On the outside, it looked like care. But timing matters. This attention arrived after years of absence, after patterns had solidified, after I had already made internal decisions that didn't require their input. And because of that, it landed differently. There was a subtle insistence to it, as if restoring proximity would automatically restore familiarity, as if showing up now could retroactively fill in the blanks of what had been missed. I found myself being asked questions that, years earlier, would have meant everything. How are you really doing? You've changed. Is everything okay? We should spend more time together. I answered honestly, but not expansively. I didn't weaponize my restraint. I didn't use these moments to unload history. I simply didn't offer more than what was true now. I'm doing well. Things have shifted. My schedule is pretty full. Some people interpreted this as distance. Others seek independence. A few seemed unsettled by the lack of emotional opening they expected to find. I could sense the underlying concern that something had slipped beyond reach. What they didn't understand was that this wasn't a phase. It wasn't a reaction. It was a result. You can't rush intimacy that wasn't maintained. You can't repair history by compressing effort into the present and calling it closeness. The attempts to fix it became more obvious over time. Sudden interest in my work, questions about my plans, offers of advice that assumed authority without shared context. I accepted none of it with resentment. I accepted it with clarity. Because the issue wasn't that they cared now, it was that they hadn't cared then, and that absence had shaped who I became. Absence doesn't erase history. That truth sat quietly between us in every interaction, even if it was never spoken aloud. At one point, someone said lightly, "You don't need to be so independent all the time." It was meant as concern, but it revealed something important. My independence made them uncomfortable because it reduced their relevance. It reminded them that I hadn't needed them to arrive here. And that discomfort wasn't something I could soothe without returning to the old role. I noticed how often the conversation drifted toward nostalgia. Stories of when we were younger, moments that emphasized togetherness. It felt like an attempt to anchor the present to a past that felt safer than the reality unfolding. I didn't argue with those memories. I just didn't let them overwrite the full timeline. There were moments when I considered saying more. When I felt the pull to explain myself, to articulate the years of quiet adjustment, the internal work, the reasons for my boundaries, but I stopped myself. Because explanation, in this context, would have served their comfort more than my truth. It would have reopened negotiations where I had already reached a resolution. The door wasn't closed, but it wasn't wide open either. By the time some family members realized that things weren't going back to normal, it was already too late to fix it the way they wanted to. The system had changed, the access had narrowed, the expectations had shifted. What remained was a choice: adapt to the new reality, or continue reaching for a version of me that no longer existed. Not everyone chose adaptation, and that was painful in its own quiet way. But it was also confirming, because real care adjusts to reality. It doesn't insist on restoring comfort at someone else's expense. I stayed calm. I stayed kind, I stayed firm, and in doing so, I allowed the truth to stand without forcing it. The confrontation, when it finally came, was quiet. No raised voices, no rehearsed speeches, no dramatic setting. It happened in the way most real things do, almost accidentally, in a moment that couldn't be postponed any longer. We were sitting together, one-on-one, in a neutral space. The kind of place where conversations can't easily be escaped, but don't feel theatrical either. There was a pause in the discussion, the kind that invites honesty if you let it. "You feel distant," they said, not accusing, just uncertain. I nodded. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "I probably am," I replied. There it was. No denial, no deflection. They waited, clearly expecting more. An explanation, a reassurance, something that would make the discomfort temporary. I didn't rush to fill the silence. What I'd learned over the past months was that filling silence too quickly robs it of its function. Silence allows truth to surface without force. After a moment, I spoke, calmly, evenly. "I don't feel angry," I said, "and I'm not trying to punish anyone, but I've changed how much of myself I give by default." That sentence landed heavier than anything emotional could have. They asked why. I answered carefully, not with a list of grievances, but with a simple framing. For a long time, I adjusted. I didn't need much, and I didn't ask for much. That became an expectation. I don't want to live inside that expectation anymore. There was a pause, a visible recalculation. They tried to reassure me, to explain, to reframe the past in softer terms. Busyness, misunderstandings, no bad intentions. I didn't argue. "I believe you," I said, and I meant it. But intention and impact aren't the same thing. That was the closest I came to naming the history directly. I didn't recount missed moments. I didn't describe the years of invisibility. I didn't ask for acknowledgement or apology. Not because those things wouldn't have mattered once, but because I no longer needed them to move forward. What I needed was for the present to be honest. "I'm okay with where things are now," I continued, "as long as we're clear about what's realistic." They asked what that meant. "It means I won't always be available. I won't explain every decision, and I won't perform closeness to make things comfortable." There was no anger in my voice, no edge, just certainty. That certainty unsettled them more than any accusation could have. People are prepared to defend themselves against blame. They are far less prepared to respond to someone who is calm, clear, and no longer negotiating. They asked if this meant I was pulling away. "I'm choosing," I said. "There's a difference." We sat with that for a while. The conversation didn't end with resolution in the traditional sense. There was no agreement, no emotional breakthrough. Just a shared understanding that something fundamental had shifted, and that it wasn't going to be undone with reassurance. When we parted, nothing dramatic happened. No doors slammed, no messages were sent afterward to clarify or soften what had been said. That was intentional, because confrontation without heat isn't about winning. It's about naming reality without escalating it. I walked away feeling steady. Not triumphant, not sad, just aligned. For the first time, I hadn't overexplained. I hadn't minimized myself. I hadn't taken responsibility for how the truth landed. And that felt like enough. Who I am now is not the opposite of who I was before. It's the same person, just no longer compressed. I didn't become colder. I didn't become detached. I became more precise. My life is quieter now, but not emptier. The noise I removed wasn't connection. It was obligation masquerading as closeness. Without it, what remains feels intentional, chosen, and honest. I still care about my family. That never disappeared. But care no longer means overextension. It doesn't mean absorbing assumptions or maintaining proximity at the cost of clarity. It means showing up where there is mutual effort and stepping back where there isn't. I've learned that distance doesn't always mean disconnection. Sometimes it's the space required for relationships to reset to a more truthful shape. Professionally, I stand differently in rooms now. Not louder, not more assertive in the obvious sense, just grounded. I speak when I have something to add, and I don't fill the silence to prove relevance. People listen differently when you're no longer trying to be palatable. Personally, I no longer rush to be understood. I've accepted that not everyone will know the full story of my growth, and that's okay. My life doesn't need an audience to be valid. The most significant change is internal. I trust my perception. For a long time, I second-guessed my reactions. I assumed I was being too sensitive, too quiet, too accommodating. Now, when something feels off, I pause instead of dismissing it. I observe. I decide. That trust has reshaped how I move through the world. I don't chase attention. I don't retreat from it either. I let it meet me where I am. Some relationships adjusted. A few didn't survive the change. That loss was real, but it wasn't chaotic. It felt like a natural thinning, like branches being pruned so the tree could grow more evenly. I no longer believe that history alone entitles anyone to access. Shared pasts matter, but they don't override present behavior. That realization brought a sense of peace I didn't expect. I'm still the reliable one, but now that reliability includes myself. I show up prepared, but not preemptively. Available, but not endlessly. Kind, but not at my own expense. When my family interacts with me now, there's a different tone, more careful, less assumed, sometimes warmer, sometimes more distant. I don't try to manage that balance. I let it find its own equilibrium. What I know is this. I don't feel invisible anymore. Not because others suddenly see me perfectly, but because I no longer disappear to make things easier. There's strength in that kind of presence. Quiet strength. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself to be real. I'm no longer waiting for acknowledgement that may never come. I'm building a life that feels complete, whether it arrives or not. And that, more than anything, tells me I made the right choice. There's a moral people often reach for in stories like this. Something sharp, something decisive, a lesson that ends with clear sides and clean conclusions. This isn't that kind of ending. No one was exposed, no one was publicly corrected, no dramatic justice unfolded in a single moment. What happened instead was quieter and more lasting. I learned that being ignored doesn't always look like rejection. Sometimes it looks like being trusted to handle everything alone. Sometimes it looks like being praised for strength while quietly being denied care. And sometimes it looks like attention arriving late, asking you to act as if timing doesn't matter. But timing does matter. Absence doesn't erase history. It shapes it. What I understand now is that many people don't intend harm. They intend comfort. They move toward what feels easy, familiar, and rewarding in the moment. When someone consistently absorbs discomfort without complaint, that behavior gets normalized. Not because others are cruel, but because systems tend to preserve what works for them. That doesn't make the system fair, and fairness doesn't require punishment to be restored. All it requires is alignment. I didn't need my family to apologize for the past in order to move forward. I needed to stop pretending it hadn't shaped me. I needed to stop offering access that wasn't being tended to. I needed to let relationships settle where mutual effort naturally placed them. Some people met me there, some didn't. That outcome wasn't something I controlled, it was something I allowed. There's a quiet dignity in choosing not to rewrite your own history to make others comfortable, in letting your boundaries speak without explanation, in understanding that you don't owe the present a performance just because the past went unexamined. I don't see myself as someone who won anything. I see myself as someone who stopped negotiating with a version of herself that no longer existed. And if there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this. You don't have to be loud to be decisive. You don't have to be angry to be done. And you don't have to punish anyone to protect your peace. Sometimes the most powerful shift is simply choosing not to fill the space where others fail to show up. If parts of this story felt familiar, if you've ever been the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who was fine until you weren't, I'd really like to hear from you. So I'll leave you with this question, and I invite you to reflect on it honestly in the comments. Have you ever noticed who shows up only after your life becomes easier to admire? And how did that change the way you see your past? Thank you for listening.